was giving. Chapter 4. The second meeting with Mr. Tiberias, in which they discuss a host of matters pertaining to the insight garnered from inveterate truth. It wasn't by happenstance that our friend Cameron met again with the enigmatic odd man in the sewer, but by a deliberate conjuring, despite Mr. Tiberias' strict instruction not to do such. However, Cameron was so eager and fed up that this morning slipped his mind entirely. This time, it would be no easy task. He tried his best to summon up the image of that previous setting directly before sleep, but it was no use. The unusual location, with that mysterious, untraceable sewer system, which could have been from a number of different time periods, and the oddly anachronistic building style made the prospect of procuring contact with Mr. Tiberias severely difficult. But what did these idiosyncrasies matter to Cameron? After all, how could he possibly know if Mr. Tiberias hadn't just been some phantom of the mind? All he knew was that he had taken quite a fortuitous nap before he had been transported to that unsettling sewer. Yet this eye creature had spoken so particularly and had been strangely provocative and helpful in its most dire times, since our poor Cameron was at the end of his tether, and he could think of no other option than to try to access him through his own natural sleeping routine, which, as he was well aware, was not at all as routine as he wished due to his near insomnia. Next, he tried imbibing alcohol, specifically rye whiskey and Campari, the concoction that the eye creature drank himself. He had to make a trip to the nearest distillery, which was on the far side of the downtown plaza. The transaction had been awkward, as Cameron was not too keen on spirits, and the streets of Blansville were more raucous than ever that particular night, which was a local holiday paying homage to a war hero by the name of George Edwins Jr., in which nearly every adult in the city would inebriate themselves in honor of a man who had ironically been sober, self-disciplined his entire life. But that's not our main focus. This was immediately evident to Cameron, as the odor of alcohol was able to be smelt for miles. Some of the passers-by began to pester Cameron for money or to promote their street businesses, but he managed to effectively dissuade them and purchase a couple of 1-liter bottles. The sight of such a wild, loose people in downtown Blansville made the prospect of getting drunk only the more off-putting. When he returned home, he poured the drinks and added a mixer to go with it to make it go down more easily. This only proved to be exceedingly soporific, and because Cameron wasn't keen on spirits, he became somewhat queasy. As he lay his head on his couch, a deep sleep overtook him almost immediately. Suddenly, a host of potent, vivid images flashed before his eyes. What happened next was not easy to explain in a way that would make sense. Cameron himself certainly couldn't recall every last bit of information. As with dreams, or whatever exactly this was, it wouldn't come back hours later in fragments and vestiges of a larger image. But what Cameron would later remember in this was that he saw a mammoth cosmic elevator of sorts, which was whirling uncontrollably around a stark black backdrop of what looked like a pure void of space, although there were refulgent bits of light flickering around, hinting that there was an assortment of other objects behind it, of which he could not discern at present. The elevator structure resembled a rectangular prism made of tin or aluminum sheets, and there was only one tiny window that did not have panes of glass to protect it as one would expect, but was left completely open so that the passenger could stick its head out if they dared. The contraption was suspended from a durable-looking steel shaft with enforced rubber and silicone woven cords lassoed around it in such a way that the steel shaft and the rectangular construction were inextricably linked. Perhaps the worst aspect of this whole device was the idea that it was a sturdy, somewhat operable, and safe, when in fact the antithesis was proved the second one entered it. However, Cameron didn't seem to have a choice in the matter. He was thrown into this bizarre, horrifying contraption with no chance to evade its foul workings, and the door slammed behind him so powerfully that the whole mechanism shook and vibrated like an earthquake had struck. It should be noted here that the door itself was made of the same type of reinforced welded carbon steel found in maximum security prison doors. This added to the auteur effect of the whole object, which rumbling erratically upwards and making Cameron sick to the stomach. He continued to be thrown haplessly around as if there was some ghostly operator, some malevolent prim in movens that was pulling the strings of this device, causing it to act so violently. However, as far as Cameron could see, given his allotted truncated view out the window, there was no such visible entities outside causing it to run. As he progressed, the nature of the space around him fluctuated intensely. At one point, tesseracts manifested themselves in strange formations from the two-dimensional lateral grid and collapsed before his eyes. A variety of other non-Euclidean geometrical prisms abounded. Shapes without an axis, hyperbolic and elliptic figures in a single plane arose and dissipated immediately. Triangles with elongated hypotenuses threatened to crash into him. Squares with their familiar four sides suddenly sprouted a preponderance of more corners and shapes before collapsing in on themselves. It was a fantastical realm where anything seemed to be possible. Shapes of all varieties appeared and then subsided with equal measure. Cameron couldn't sense any tactile features to these objects and phenomena that flashed before him, and he dared not venture out of his vessel lest he be crushed by the tesseract or any other object. He simply stood back and observed in a state of disbelief and excitement. The shapes manifested themselves in all variations of color, like pink and yellow to green and blue. The space behind him altered into a pale, spotless white background that never appeared to have a tangible end. Seeing that the shapes had momentarily subsided, he felt considerably more daring, and reached out and tried to touch it, hoping to find a discernible wall of some kind. But the closer he got, the further the plane drew away, much like the end of a rainbow. This bizarre phenomenon looked deceptively like it could be felt and made real or unreal by Cameron in his search for an authentic, earthly, experiential laws to hold up to this maddening, unknown, inexplicable territory. At this point, he began to suspect that something aside from just liquor had been put in his drink, as these were the kind of cerebral landscapes often described by people on psychedelics. However, he had no time to dwell on the matters, as he was continuously being assailed by the shapes around him, some of which were translucent, while others were opaque, were constructed from foamy matter. It was like an ocean of vacancy where no space offered him hope of reaching an end, any end. "Oh God, give me a clue," he thought. "Give me anything to call familiar, close, and knowable." But there was only an unreachable infinitude in that sea of odd shapes that closed in on each other, and even images of Ouroboros, snake-like entities eating themselves in endless recursion. There were that were imaginable only in the realm of abstract, lucid, hyper-realistic geometry. A different observer might have noted that the geometrical postulates of John Playfair seemed to abound, whereas Euclid's parallel postulate had no power, in circles and spheres formed not only from a radius line, but out of thin air. The law that four spheres can share the same right-angle points only in two-dimensional Euclidean space was meaningless. Once a hyperboloid was extended, it had copious space, not just for 5 or 7, but infinitely more squares to fit and still share right angles. Once the shapes got progressively more complex, they resembled flowers with their intricate, boundless, spiking shapes that wove together. We can only imagine that if Cameron had any foreknowledge of what this all meant, he would have declared, "Oh, curse the day that Pythagoras visited Egypt." It was clear that once a line is drawn upon a plane, in theory, it knows no limits, west or east, up and down, 2 degrees to the left or right, or any feasible variety of direction. The point is that it continues indefinitely, ad infinitum, and thus it appeared to our poor Cameron, as he was drifting on this cataclysmic entropy of dispersive and interconnected shapes. He would drift into tunnels that looked lengthy on the outside, but they would in actuality turn out to be short. By contrast, he would go into some tunnels expecting to venture up a hill, only to find out it took him downhill instead. Visible inclines that appeared to lead uphill were in fact going downwards. Every perception was deceptive and defied worldly logic. As for the time, there was no direct way of telling how long he was in this contraption. Cameron would have guessed that it felt like only 15 minutes or so. However, when he endured these psychic-defying tunnels, time slowed down in ways he couldn't fathom. It felt as if, because the phenomena were passing by him so swiftly, there was no consistent external object to measure time against. He had no way of telling for certain how long he was on the device. Now, new distortions gradually became apparent. Isosceles trapezoids seemed to form out of an array of images, but then promptly turned to dodecahedrons instead. It was not unlike the Ames illusion, wherein, from one side of the panorama's plane appeared to be smaller than the other, where in fact only the distance from the axis was increased. Fractals started appearing too, endless potential streams of smaller, similar shapes that burst out of other shapes in astounding complexity. The elevator device was proceeding at a steady plane and was no longer shaking as pugnaciously. And in this wretched sea that knew no borders, there were no explicable rules either. It was not that a friendly, familiar rule, say of Aristotle or Newton concerning the law of thermodynamics. It was a frantic, unruly place of geometry that knew no rules and abided in no axioms. Whatever variety of shape that was able to be imagined in the mind of no matter how irrelevant was capable of appearing immediately. Could this have been a crude, horrific nightmare? Was there any actual sense of danger in its situation? In the inner, isolated space of this world, Cameron could only hope for survival, and the lucidity of his mind began to wane rapidly. The images before him were so vivid and arbitrary that they couldn't have come directly from his imagination, however repressed or dormant it might have been. Cameron tested this hypothesis by calling out audibly for a pyramid to be created out of the midst of innumerable shapes, but no such figures emerged, leading him to believe that he was not in control of this odd stream of events. This is all a stupid dream, an interestingly bizarre but maddening show of obscure mathematical hypothetical delusions that I spun up to torment myself. Maybe I deserve it for letting myself down. Maybe it's my fate. Mr. Tiberias, you got me in this damn mess. Get me out of here. Cameron shrieked at the top of his lungs and pounded his fists on the wall of the cube-shaped vessel that floated into increasingly convoluted territory wherein fractals duplicated and dodecahedrons compounded into a vast array of colorful branch-like formations. It occurred to Cameron in this moment that math could be quite beautiful in the midst of this disorder as he drew closer to their sea lion-shaped formations with numerous hexahedrons moved in unison and became stuck in a recursive motion of what felt like an eternity. How could it be that the geometry, this sacred science of perfect summation of numbers that had enraptured the likes of Pythagoras, could be so stunning and beneficent, yet cruelly indifferent at the same time? Was the universe, at least in this dream state version, merely a hodgepodge perpetuation of entropy and madness? Or was it an almost religious factoring of pure symmetry and order? It seemed that the more Cameron bellowed and objected, the more complicated everything became. Suddenly, the horizon above him eclipsed into a frightful, dark, bellicose, astral-like background, while the ground beneath him swallowed up all the shapes that had been reproducing the patterns, and he was swept away by a fierce cyclone of dust. The outlandish scenery that had occupied his attention folded in on itself, and an immense black hole tore through the place, and every last shape was swallowed up save for the vessel Cameron was in, as it was tethered, surprisingly effectively, to a nearby metal anchor. At last, the entire landscape was devoid of any ostensible item. Cameron gasped for air, which allowed him a calming reprieve. But his relief did not last long, as he saw a rapid change in the air take place. 4 mammoth pillars ascended from the ground and shot upward, causing the whole area to tremble. They were followed by a large, opaque, turbid floating orb, apparently not suspended by anything. Instead, it hovered at a steady speed and roughly 30 feet away. It was hard to be sure that the concepts of time and distance were so tenuous here, and spun itself around gradually. The globe had etched on it words in a language, code, or alphabet that seemed completely unrenderable. There were some figures that bore vague similarity to Celtic runes, with illegible squiggles, forks, ovals, and crosses, but none of it combined together into a cohesive pattern. Just then, an owl flew down from the opening in the horizon and perched itself on top of the globe, making a sound like a trumpet. At once, the globe shrunk to the size of a golf ball and slipped into the cracks which opened beneath it. The owl flew away, but rather than egressing through the crack, a ball of fierce fire engulfed it, and it was gone. The cracks continued spreading all over the ground, breaking open in every direction until there was hardly anywhere left to stand. Cameron, though still ensconced in the vessel, shook with sheer fright and held on for dear life. The violent quakes continued until the pillars crumbled into shambles and fired debris in every direction. Cameron felt safer inside the sheltered mechanism, which was furnished with a generous amount of shielding, despite not feeling as if he was really secure. Finally, the sound of quake subsided, and he felt tremors continuing. He heard no accompanying sound. The vessel came to an abrupt halt, and he saw that the landscape around him was merely walls covered in landscape murals that camouflaged their true nature. The walls had been pulverized as well, and they collapsed forcefully down on the ground. The actual setting that surrounded these walls had a bitter familiarity to Cameron. He peered through the wreckage and dust, and clouded his already obfuscated vision, and recognized the building beyond the rubble. It was the underground sewer area, with a little leisure cottage and lounge area of which Mr. Tiberias was currently a tenant, or so he thought. While Cameron's sight may have been flawed, his memory had slowly returned to him, as if he could suddenly recall events, objects, and people with precise detail, as if they had been implanted in his mind against his will. As the nebula of dust dwindled, he saw Mr. Tiberias himself, with his pipe, as always, supine on the porch area of his home. Cameron shuffled in the little space and mustered what little stamina he had the will to belt out. "Mr. Tiberias! Help! I'm stuck in this floating prison cell. I've never felt so close to death. It was insane." Suddenly, the vessel lowered it safely onto the ground, and the indomitable steel door swung open. Cameron exited it with relief, but then he realized that it must have been Mr. Tiberias's wacker, clever, but ultimately perilous idea all along to put him in this strange aeronautic device and have him flown through the geometrical variation of Dante's Hell sans the aid of Virgil. A cross expression spread across his face, and as he heatedly accosted his mental tormentor. "Damn it, you heartless, unfeeling, conniving bastard! You could have gotten me killed in that thing!" Cameron waved a finger in his face, which was partially covered by a book. Mr. Tiberias was reclining tranquilly on his sofa, with book in hand, and a pipe on the porch, of a similar structure to the one that had surrounded the sewer of their first meeting, though it was much cleaner and painted stark white. He seemed more engaged in reading than smoking, and was unfazed by Cameron's tirade. "Ah, Cameron, my earthly friend, I see you've made it here in one piece. Do tell me the nature of the fruity cocktail you imbibed like a pretentious alchemist. You didn't suppose that you could summon me up like some kind of poltergeist or dead soul waiting to be integrated into the metaphysical realm? You really thought I was some silly demon like Glacer Labolus, that one that could be conjured up on the chanting or incantation of a silly spell? You never ceased to amaze me. By the way, I would have not dreamt of killing you. The point is that you've arrived here safely and soundly as planned. Did you not trust me? Besides, I thought you were convinced that I was only in your imagination." Cameron calmed down slightly, but was still buzzing with frenetic energy. "It doesn't matter that I've turned out all right. You've put me through pure hell to get here. What I went through was not enjoyable or productive in the least. It was frightening, strange, confusing, and most of all, unnecessary. Did that ever cross your mind?" Mr. Tiberias reluctantly put down his book and adjusted his pince-nez, which had only one large eyeglass hanging on his face. His pupil dilated and focused directly on Cameron, who stood with folded arms in anticipation. "Listen, dear friend. If you wish to know the true reason you arrived in such a bedraggled, congested manner, it was sadly because of the impatient, eccentric method you used to summon me. I thought I made it abundantly clear that you were not to consume alcoholic substances in an attempt to reach me, as it would complicate the natural, uninhibited process by which you find your way. But no, you only wanted to expedite your arrival and thus worsen the degree to which dreams and reality fuse together. Because of your impatience, you've made those profusion of tethers which are anchored tautly in the due place to falter and depreciate until they're friable at best. You couldn't wait for me, could you? Let it be clear, man of the Highlands, I cannot and will not be beckoned here as if my duties extended to that of a witless dog without an owner. Am I merely an animal who lives feral in a sewer and heeds the distant calls of an earthly diminutive lickspittle who has tired of performing his own mongrel duties, so he resigns his Diogenean nature, leaves the streets, and chooses to begin his own unique school of thought? I do not intend to be so insulting. If anything, I am only half the dog I wish I was. Tell me more, most cultivated wise man. Tell me the optimum way you go about this dream and logic business. Actually, don't bother fretting your pretty head about it. I only asked oratorically. Yes, it is true. Life is as a dream, as the idealists, particularly that of the German variety, say. All reality is subjectively perceived through the fundamentally illogical acuity of idea and given representation in phenomena. One thinks of the woeful solipsism of Bishop George Berkeley and his immaterialism. Any methods of proving this objective thing in itself exists proves to be iterative and fruitless. Kant, Schelling, and Fichte already embroiled us thinkers in the sticky business of metaphysics, where no objective, absolute knowledge can be known about these noumena. Kierkegaard claimed that it was nigh impossible to know what was the true objective ethical standard is, much less what direction one is to take in life, and that one is stunned by this paralyzing angst as a result. This sickness unto death, the awareness of our inevitable biological and ultimate demise, reduces us to restless creatures with no grasp on reality. He also admired pagans who burned with passion rather than Christians who had none. Thus we've spent these centuries submerged in theory, phenomenology, psychology, and what good has it done us? We intellectuals need not hurt our heads with endless myriad of recursive, circuitous, perplexing theories that engender one protuberant, unkempt lesion after another, and cannot be definitively concluded. Therefore, we must, in my honest opinion, adhere to a strict determinist, materialist, positivist view of the universe. It is our saving hope. There is no need to hurt our heads thinking about nonsense, in maybes or ideals. We have a plethora of empirical evidence before us. We have the certitude of science. A rationalist and a true philosopher will stick his nose in the physics of the likes of Robert Hooke, as much as he did Spinoza or Descartes. We need practical, immediate action and data before we can categorize metaphysical or spatial realms. We act as though we are vigorous thinkers with a cure for everything. Instead, I'd accept my own stupidity and foolish before I admit to being an intellectual. Oh, how I loathe saying that word. How it flays and spoils the tongue, as if you just tasted lead. Save the blasted word for the pretentious Parisian cafes. I admire men who innovate, experiment, and have a crack at deconstructing machinery and delineating its more intricate processes, its effortlessly cohesive array of bolts and wheels, each as important as the other. I want to know how things work, to peel back the layers of automata and see their inner workings pipe away like a beehive of efficacious wonder. How idle are words in their tendency to stifle one's inhibition. How precarious are those who spew them into shape and mold a remote, intangible idea in the realm of forms, only to recant their views moments later. How fickle are we academics. Let me be clear. I count myself among the ranks of the unfortunate types who dare call themselves purebred intellectual. Those who bask in the dissolute torpor of the studious life that shuts one up in rooms crammed with tumid books. I'll take the life of a pioneer any time. We must tend to our own madhouses, as each of us, within our deepest recesses of thought, harbor an asylum of conflicting ideas, personalities, decisions, memories, and concepts, all of which constantly clash with each other in an endless contention for victory, but it never comes. Who's to say that the maddest among us aren't the true sober ones, who will be the benefactor of iconoclasm, swordsmen of wit, harbingers of deepest wisdom, and heralds of new ideas? It takes one who appears to be bacchanalian and insane at their best, those like Friedrich Hölderlin, to truly reap bountiful harvests of new territory and maverick thinking. You see, the trick is going mad to just the right extent. To spend one's life in solitary confinement a la Sade is a contemptible notion. Though he pushed the boundaries of his provocateur works of daring and obscenity, licentious, hedonistic hobbies, and risked expurgates on all his work, he must occupy the bookshelves of anyone who dares wish to be viewed as a serious thinker. To wince and squirm when they hear his name is juvenile, prudish behavior. A true curator of knowledge accepts both good and evil even in their excessive states. For what is good and evil but uncertain, arbitrary maneuvers we use to gain prosperity for the sake of our own ego? The Gnostics had it right. It is disingenuous to only present good in its entirety and leave no room for evil acts. Instead, in order to perceive a thorough span of morality and humanity as a whole, we must accept the evil, profane, and wicked elements as well. That is the thought of the god Abraxas, whose roots lie in Egypt and are carried out to the present. They are flirted with numerous esoteric secret societies, yet the god asks nothing by way of forgiveness, self-denial, or suffering. He accepts life in its finitude and with all its defects. He embraces the sting of audacious fate. Though it belies the cozy forecasts of the telos of a seductive afterlife, all those reprehensible acts which make us fidget and writhe are truthfully the finest aspect of this ridiculous scale that we call good and evil. However, monks in most religions still lead tortuous lives of monastic duty and doctrinaire behavior. How often had you indulged in something so debased that you didn't even confide it to anyone else? How often had we had such acts of disobedience, defiance, pleasure of the senses, of the companionship of spirits, and felt so alive? How often have you felt the thrill of excitement and desire, magically, after years of fomenting languidly, in a sudden beauteous display of freedom and leisure, to finally do as thou wilt? And how often have religion, churches, workplaces, and societies at large put a muzzle on that which is most human? How many times have we seen those parts of us which are most blissful and radiant to be dampened by the stinking, putrefied, looming mortuary of modern proper civilization? My friend Cameron, you speak so lugubriously about how I wronged you, but in this pageant of non-Euclidean pandemonium, did you not feel alive? Even if you assert with utmost conviction that this is all a pesky, silly dream, say it however you please. I will corroborate you in that respect to render you ill at ease. Yet even this dream you speak of happens to be the most realistic, primeval, tangible event that you've ever experienced in your entire life. Forgive the tenacity of my assertion, but it's true. Despite our disagreements, I will offer my condolence and admiration. Truthfully, you've made it further than the last person. He went stark mad only after the first period. What a shameful waste of a good man. He just fretted too much about his circumstances and began displaying discordantly unhinged behaviour. You aren't easily vexed, are you? As Mr. Tiberias spoke, he enthusiastically waved his arms about, and when he uttered the word reprehensible in regard to Sod, it was as if he were acting as an advocate rather than taking sides. When he finished speaking, he stopped as if to let Cameron respond or digest what he said, but Cameron said nothing and only shook his head at Tiberias's final question. In actuality, Cameron really didn't know whether he was as anxious or bothered as he seemed. Often, in the morning especially, he felt exceptionally all right, and on top of that, adequate enough to engage in his work without qualms. Other times, typically by about midday, he felt the negative effects of over-caffeination set in, and he felt like the grips of hot leather hands of an incorporeal host were lingering over him, awaiting any mistake he made, however so slight, so as to seek immediate punitive measures. It was as if a second ghostly version of Mr. Singer took over his duties when he was away and kept constant looming guard over him. At other times, Cameron felt surprisingly all right. An air of gratitude, wonder, and excitement came over him. It was usually some time in the afternoon when he felt this way, and he took every opportunity to capitalize on this higher energy to be more productive. When this happened, he cherished the feeling. However, such moments were ephemeral and subsided as quickly as they arrived. All in all, one could say that Cameron was not much different from everyone else. He worked regularly, went through the phases that ranged from capriciously spasmodic to almost predictable. He couldn't categorize himself as moody per se, but as conscientious, practical, easygoing, and sensitive to his surroundings. For the longest time, as far back as he could remember, Cameron had done what he was told, by his father, mother, older classmates, seniors, teachers, counselors, and every peer imaginable, so that by the time he was able to make his own decisions, that great big avalanche of why came crashing down on him so unforgivingly and without warning. The standard questioning that arose when one reached adulthood, such as, what do you want to do for a living, what do you want out of life, or where do you see yourself in 5 years, had been hurled incessantly at him, as they are at many children. Though he had never considered himself particularly thoughtful, inquisitive, or an imaginative person, he felt the weight of these decisions and their boundless possibilities bear down on him. He often felt that he didn't have the slightest clue who he was, what he wanted to do, or how he wanted to do it. When someone, a peer perhaps, attempted to figure him out and to categorize him, they would say things such as, well, Cameron appears to be an orderly, duty-driven, doting type who's anathema to chaos and heartlessness, so we can safely say that you're best fit for an organized office environment that requires honesty, diligence, and hard work. Though Cameron would nod sedately to such statements, inside he would be squirming with confoundment. I really don't know, he would think. I suppose I could call myself organized. Maybe I like being alone. Or maybe I prefer the company of others. I maybe find the idea of working the same job for almost 20 years doable. I really don't know who I am. I'm all those things. I suppose in some situations I'm a bit uncomfortable around those who I don't know really well and remain laconic, but in other scenarios with more inveterate friends, I find myself choosing to talk with them with considerable enthusiasm. I just really don't know. Everybody else seemed to choose what they wanted to do in life for life with such ease. For them, a choice of careers that would devour their lives took little to no thought. If their father was a lawyer, there was no confusion in what their son or daughter ought to do. No one else appeared to be stultified by this lack of resolution. When Cameron took time to make important decisions, it was not because he was lazy by any means. It was just that he preferred to ensure whatever he ended up committing his time to was 100% a confidently good decision. However, he missed out on a fair deal of life because of this proclivity. He did not adapt well to the ever-changing world around him, and felt hindered by an overabundance of options, and settled for a kind of Occam's razor of choice, choosing the option that required least amount of assumptions. Every day for him was filled with a plethora of what could have been, and squandered time in the present brooding over lost time in the past. While he didn't ruminate on these sentiments as much as he had when he was younger, he felt an avalanche of dubious anxiety hitting him like a wall of bricks in the last decade or so, and felt almost immobilized by his misgivings at times. Moreover, he felt it was necessary to dispose of these urges, thinking they would interfere negatively with his job and compromise his work relationships. Hence, he left these matters untended to, which of course only worsened their effects and caused them to swell indefinitely. This inner conflict had made itself apparent to Mr. Tiberias, who looked as if he could smell or see a person's weaknesses from several miles away, like a bloodhound with clever polemics. "Listen, Mr. Tiberias, I'm not feeling too well," Cameron began, easing up a little. "It might have been the spirits. You're right. I had the wrong idea when I blamed you for my own damn faults. Next time, I'll be sure to follow your advice. The truth is that, well, I don't know what the truth is. I get hung up on very abstract concepts. People will say the world is one way with such confidence, and then minutes later, somebody else will contradict that, and their views will be held tantamount to reality, when in fact they're merely the unfounded opinions of flawed, untrustworthy people who have no notion of consistency. I don't know much, but I know that the world is more infinitely complex than I bargained for, especially after that geometrical hell. I can't begin to even grasp the outermost superficial layer of it, so when somebody says with such confidence that they have the answers without having given more than a few minutes' thought to something, I can't help but feel deeply skeptical. If so many people are so sure about their opinions, they should be held accountable for proving them. For example, I thought for the longest time that time and material objects were all set things in consistent motion, like Newton said, and that all these were well understood by mathematics and other disciplines. Now I've just seen the opposite unfold before my very eyes. I don't know what to believe. I'm sorry. I'm a bit lost. My stomach is still in knots." Mr. Tiberias shifted his body from the torso up in Cameron's direction and took a sip of gin. After doing so, he straightened his back as if it were giving him a sudden burst of energy. "Ah, did those hills get you? In order to go up, one must go down, silly. These hills run both ways. In fact, the inverse is often true, except when you twist the laws of Sholba Sutras, the Egyptians with their frustrums, and poor Euclid with his infallible postulates. It's quite fun to toy around with 2 millenniums of tried mathematics and science. It gives me such joy to see the conjectures of supposed rules of science be turned on their heads until a prism is no longer an object confined by rational numbers, while a parabola and marks of deviations on a graph, well, they become whatever they could be in their infinite space, rather than a silly, authoritarian graph relying on space on time. Euclid and the Greek traditionalists would never even consider such possibilities. The universe is in a constant state of change. New is constantly supplanting and doing away with the old. Hegel taught us that history is destined to be devoured by the future. History, in general, is therefore the development of spirit in time, as nature is the development of the idea as space. Old ideas are integrated, if usable, and time continues treading boldly forward, leaving no stone left unturned. Events repeat themselves eternally, as in Nietzsche's eternal recurrence. Oh, the Eastern philosophy of time as a flat circle does make perfect drawing space for new preponderance of shapes, ideas, and forms that will lead us boldly into the future. Will you be like those in Plato's cave, left imprisoned in shackles to observe the treacherous shadow on the cave walls? Or will your eyes adjust to the illuminating splendor of truth? Are you daring enough? Remember what St. Anselm said about the realm of possible world. Of course, he applied it to the ontological proofs for God and ended up pointing only to the probable existence of unicorns or anything of the highest good or summum bonum. Theoretically, boundless, unrigid, changing shapes and theorems are wholly possible if God is too. Cheer up, boy. Don't look so disconsolate. Don't go looking as one of those sorrowful, world-weary priests I talked about. You're in a place like no other. You're here because truly deep down you want to be here, though it may seem at odds with your inner static desires to be rigid and conscientious. You didn't think I caught on to your character? Remember, son, I can see exceedingly well." At this point, a peculiar, greasy, slippery sound emanated from the corridor adjacent to the tunnel from the 20-odd paces or so from the cottage. It was the noise of something moist, which sounded like it was trembling. Cameron did not dare peek outside the corner to see what it was. Whatever it was, he thought, it could be dangerous. There was no telling what creatures, whether they were product of a reverie or reality, lay dormant in that swampy, dingy sewer. Mr. Tiberias, who appeared to be unfazed by the noise, perked his head upward to try to get a glance, but decided that he didn't need to. "Ah, that must be Mr. Spencer around the corner. I figured he'd never show up. He's typically such a late comer. I'd like to introduce you to him. He's one of my own acquaintances. Mr. Spencer, I'd like you to meet my friend Cameron. He has such an ear for languages. He's brilliant, honestly. There he is now, hiding around here somewhere. He's a bit shy, don't be offended, but he can really be quite the talker. Mr. Tiberias dynamically gestured to Cameron to follow him to the porch of the little cottage over the opening of the sewer tunnel and scattered railroad remnants where they could begin to see the outline of some kind of creature from which only the unshapely form of something breathing was visible at a distance. A few steps later, Cameron could see precisely what the figure was. It alarmed him so much that he hid part of his face and let out an audible gasp. What was this unusual creature before him? It was no easy task to describe it. It was of a considerable size, about the magnitude of a football, a living, breathing personage in the shape of what had an undeniable resemblance to the human ear. On its upper middle area sat two beady black eyes that blinked frequently and apparently operated not like human eyes, but more like those of birds or reptiles. It spoke out of the same ear that it presumably heard out of and maintained a look of discomfort and dissatisfaction. Yet it was nearly impossible to garner what mood it was in, as it had no formal facial features or movements that are characteristic of humans. He was simply an ear with two eyes and a hole for speech. Nothing else. No nose, no body, no head, or any other body part at all. In the state that this creature was in, he looked absolutely helpless and somewhat pitiable, as he was laying on a grimy, muck-soaked cushion that simply added a barrier between him and the ground, but offered little apparent comfort. The sight of this perturbed Cameron more than the sight of Mr. Tiberias had when he had first laid eyes on him. At least with Tiberias, he thought, despite initial unsettling appearances, there was some discernible similarity to the human, with his movements, behaviors, and speech. The latter may have been odd, but it seemed to put him at ease once he accepted the initial shock. Mr. Tiberias approached the ear. "So, I was right. It is him, sitting here all in his lonesome. How are you, my dear friend?" Mr. Tiberias exclaimed eagerly. "I'm sorry," Mr. Spencer bellowed with a voice that was surprisingly thunderous, albeit somewhat frail, echoing throughout the sewer. "I cannot hear you. Speak up, please." "My apologies," responded Mr. Tiberias, who resorted to shouting. "How you were on this magnificently sunny day?" "I'm not too swell, to be frank. I've lost my glasses somewhere. I think they fell there in the mire nearby. It's a shame. They were the best I had. If I had to guess, I think it was that good-for-nothing rat friend of yours who swiped them from me. I can smell it, if you get my drift. He didn't even need 'em." Mr. Spencer spat this out with a potently bitter and caustic voice, as if he were ready to break into a tantrum or a fit of hysterics at any moment. "I believe the person who's in the least need of glasses is you, my friend," Mr. Tiberias asserted. "Your eyesight isn't a problem. Even if it were, what would you need to gaze at? The ceiling above you? There's nothing else in this bleak, revolting place anyway. How I long for color. One might as well be blind. What silliness. What you need now more than ever is to fix that faulty hearing of yours. I'm tired of shouting at you so incessantly. It's no use. Get yourself a hearing horn. If you're deaf and blind, what use are you? One of us can be blind, but not both. That would compromise the whole situation." Mr. Tiberias looked peevishly at Mr. Spencer in a manner that hinted that it was not the first time that this happened, and might probably not be the last. "Well, if I had a whole library to myself to read idle, fickle books all day, then I suppose a good pair of eyes would come in handy," Mr. Singer proclaimed longingly. "But I was not blessed with the simple amenities of a body like the rest of you privileged ones fortunate enough to be able to walk, eat, and enjoy life." He eyed up both Mr. Tiberias and Cameron accusingly. "Well, allow me to give you a proper introduction to Mr. Spencer, as he has inevitably taken to complaining again and lost all class. He is the dignitary to myself and Mr. Goncourt, who you will meet later. Though he may look as if he isn't capable of much, he's done far more for the service than you and I combined. He's processed millions of requests, expediencies, and countless other miscellaneous procedures. He makes it look so effortless, yet I am certain his labors in the business of the dead letters are ceaseless. He can file through an even stack of 400 or more letters in no more than an hour. This is what I call the Acropolis of efficiency. However, even if one were to put a wooden Pinard horn straight to his ear, he wouldn't be able to hear for the life of him. That reminds me, in order for this conversation to be even partially fruitful, I must fetch his hearing aid right away." As Mr. Tiberias turned around and skipped away to fetch the hearing aid, Mr. Spencer looked around and steadily fixated his beady eyes on Cameron. "Would you please send a message for my wife?" Mr. Spencer croaked with a broken, thin voice. "I would be gratefully indebted. She is on the other side. A bit stuck, I must say. It's such a misfortune. The last time I spoke to her was 11 years ago. I said something foolish, and I regret it with every aching moment. I didn't know that this would be how things would turn out. I thought I still had time. But time means nothing in a world devoid of truth or even geometrical rubrics. I just want to make things right again before it's too late. She still has time, at least. I don't. In all sincerity, I may as well be dead. Instead of giving me the satisfaction of painless death, they opted to play a cruel trick on me, swap me up. I've never been the same since. I wouldn't dare go back anyway. I'm an aberration meant to be hidden away. Now I'm absolutely done for and good as dead. Let this be a cautionary tale to you, my young acquaintance. Don't be so hasty and thoughtless in this life. Hold on dearly to those you love and adore the most, because soon you'll only have yourself to hold on to, and that's not so enjoyable. I mean, it's not as bad as it seems, right? At least you're still alive, Cameron observed, attempting to ameliorate Mr. Spencer's bleak situation. Drat! What nonsense, Mr. Spencer replied. As if the alternative to life as a non-entity is not a viable option. My life from beginning to present has been a never-ending, tumultuous, painful, senselessly harrowing journey marked by constant self-doubt and constriction. How in any way is that validated? Why should I continue living if it's not the sum of harrowing boulders crushing on me ever so brutally as old Giles Corey was in the trials? If life entails such extraneous suffering and idle nonsense, I prefer to be no one. I practically am. A negation of life is a net positive for those who have dreams to live out, but my silly head is devoid of any such dreams. I cannot be transcended to a momentary bliss and peace like the Tibetans do. At this point, Mr. Tiberias returned with a hearing aid and applied it to Mr. Spencer's oddity of an ear, stepped back and took a thoughtful drag of his pipe, and responded blithely. I'd say it's no use getting upset like a surly child over trite matters that have no greater impact on the world. Remember what I said about the mayfly. It lives and breathes and without knowing that its life is transient, insignificant, and almost indistinguishable in the grand scheme of the universe. And why should it? What good does consciousness do us? Look, we all have consciousness, deliberate, distinct individualism, and a subjective quality, yet we are miserable. What contentment or propriety has knowing ever gained us? I'll take the Buddhist route and deny all desires, concepts, and cumbersome ideas in exchange to accept a state of utmost serenity. It is how we are born, as Rousseau states. We are born free, but men everywhere are in chains. I extend that definition of chains to ideologies, societies, intellect, and culture, and the very same culture that we derive a sense of meaning and purpose from because we are incapable of forming that meaning for ourselves. Our freedom intimidates us, as Kierkegaard puts us. People demand freedom of speech as a compensation for the freedom of thought which they seldom use. We are paralyzed by angst and Weltschmerz, so we leave it up to the state to mold us into whatever shape they wish, and rarely their intentions are not perfidious. I don't want to believe in anything. The notion of succumbing to any political doctrine renders me revolted, and with my stomach in knots. I reject all credence and certainty. I am ever doubtful. Yet Mr. Spencer was not in the mood to appreciate Mr. Tiberias's polemics. Devil take you in your pithy, two-faced monologues. Please don't tell me he recites these saccharine, navel-gazing platitudes to you, Cameron. You speak so highly of freedom, Mr. Tiberias. I'm curious. Where is this freedom? Because I fail to see it anywhere. You claim it is good that I exist, yet here I am existing, but aimless suffering is my constant companion. I'd be better off not having been born at all, for it is only in living that I know pain. For me, it is inordinate and outweighs whatever modicum of good I've ever seen. What good does your Rousseau do you, a man who posits that a man in his natural state, a noble savage, is fundamentally good-natured? I suppose this means your natural habits, the likes of lust, gluttony, and greed, and envy are noble. Look at me, a free man, yet I am in chains as a punishment for my own vice. I was so decadent and superfluously fattened by my own sin, I could hardly move in the real world. Now, I am no better. Where is this freedom? Though it was difficult to fully understand what he was feeling, Mr. Spencer's drawling, repetitious voice created an overall aura of discontent. Enough with your childish petulance. The fact is that by some miracle you've arrived here in one piece after some trouble, and you have a duty like the rest of us. You aren't any different simply because you experience more pain. Or if it is this case, then I can only send my private condolences, and there's unfortunately nothing further I can do to assist you in your plight. You could have got me out of this damn sewer when you had the chance, Mr. Spencer injected scathingly. You know as well as I do that there was nothing I could do about that. What's done is done. On the contrary, I do recall offering you a deal quite a while ago, but you were resistant to my suggestions. If you do not trust me, that is no issue of mine, but don't go on spreading lies about me. I could still help you, but you seem suspicious of everything. Or would you perhaps rather not exist at all? I can make that happen quite easily. Don't be roy with me. I know exactly what you've been up to. I know that you didn't come down here by way of misfortune. It was all planned. I'm probably shattering your human friends' trust in you and as I speak. Well, I should. No one should trust you. Mr. Spencer was practically spitting his words out, and it looked as if he was causing him a fair deal of pain. I have very good reasons for being so. Though I respect your work as a dignitary, you can't keep wasting everyone's time with your dross language and scathing remarks. As for the rumours, I don't care for conjectural, deluded calumny made by a wretched ear for a man who can't even hear properly. Mr. Tiberias was nearly spitting too, but he just about maintained control over his temper, even if it was difficult to tell, as he was forced to shout anyway. I never wanted to be involved with this idiotic state of affairs anyway, but now I have no choice. I must live out my bland existence at the whim of a silly eye who talks haughtily all day, with ease, but cannot be bothered to physically exert himself for once. I just ask you to leave me out of it. What a fool I am. I got myself into this mess. I can almost hear my wife. She's probably carrying on as per usual, doing a fine job as a financial service advisor at the Penny Dreadful Bank. She was there for 15 years, the last I remember. It was a moonlit, cool night when I left, our 11th anniversary. She was lighting some candles and cooking dinner in that happy-go-lucky way of hers. She loved to joke, but she was a great foil to my inherent lugubriousness. I remember distinctly the last words I heard from her were, I hope you have a great time on your business trip. Of course, the prospect of great time and business trip being anything other than an oxymoron is worth addressing, yet I digress. She was always so tender and naturally matriarchal. I should have had children with her, but the time never seemed right. When life moves with such graceful effortlessness, it's difficult to see the greater implications between the lines. A moment, even a tender one, appears as just another moment etched into the mundane ambience, and you think nothing of it. Yet, in retrospect, that very moment becomes sacred, and you hold on to it with hopeful resolution, hoping that even if 1,000 other events shattered dismally before you, even if 1,000,000 years passed on by unnoticed and forgotten, even if every other avenue in your life may have provoked pure failure, this moment alone counts. The one that made it into the deific catalogue of fond moments etched into history. That exact precise location where the lighting was just right, as if it were illuminated by Apollo himself, with the scenery looking as if it were crafted by divine cherubs who plucked out their arrows and aimed at the most vulnerable parts of your being, your heart. Your lover sits in delicate anticipation. Her eyes is a penetrating pair of irises consumed by fire and delight. Yet she is composed amidst the most turbulent of storms and not swayed by the perturbation of motion. Yet I digress again. I do not know if she were married. I'll cross my finger and hope that she didn't, and will never do so. But it really makes no difference, and it sounds selfish anyway, to constrict her love to me, as if I were any more deserving of it than a mussel at the bottom of the ocean. Life continues in its recurrent atmosphere, and I doubt that they would spend as much time mourning over me. She never struck me as the depressive type, like I was always inclined to be. I believe she might have remarried despite her undying love for me simply because she so desired children. Lord knows how much I wanted them, but I was too selfish and distracted by all the paltry, insignificant circumstances that should have waited. Now I spend all my days waiting for a time when life isn't as despondent, in a world not so austere and ineffably miserable. I've grown accustomed to these muck-bespeckled ceilings, and the dark ghostly tunnels, and the drab ill air of the place. It almost resembles a grotesque inverse of Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, if it weren't so moribund and spattered with filth. I become like a snail that tiresomely trudges along with what little effort it can offer. However, to a snail, time seems to progress just the same as it does for us. They don't appear to be in any grand conclusions or due demands by the universe and nature. As Lao Tzu said, nature doesn't hurry, yet everything is accomplished. Mr. Spencer spoke with a fragile voice that sounded as if he were on the brink of weeping. Perhaps it was simply that he was difficult to understand and wished not to be seen as he was now, in such a low state. Both Cameron and Mr. Tiberias looked on in confoundment tinged with empathy from the former and dog-like pity from the latter. Cameron offered some solace. "I'm so sorry to hear about that. It's never a good case when you've lost someone you love. Having lost connection with some of my own family, as they were divided from me on the other side of the country and dispersed in their own lives, I can understand your sadness. It was a very difficult time of grieving for me, when I found out one of my own aunts had passed on and I couldn't attend her funeral. I normally process guilt in a very one-dimensional way at first, and attempt to keep my calm. But weeks, maybe months down the road, the weight of the sadness will hit me, and all at once I'll just break down. I don't know how I manage to do it, to keep my cool. I guess it isn't really healthy. I suppose you have it right. You're honest about your losses in life and don't try to conform to any given standard on how to mourn." Cameron found expressing this part of him somewhat difficult and decided to stop, lest Mr. Spencer take over, as it looked like he had something to say. "But have you lost your entire life?" Mr. Spencer asked, with a rueful sullenness. "Temporal division is one thing. You can see them in brief increments, but a completely cruel metamorphosis from who you once were into what I am now, with the addition of my wife being cast far from me, is an entirely different thing. In the world I was somebody, not necessarily a man of high status nor political power, or even a unique imaginative sort. Yet I had someone to call my own. I had a little home in a good neighborhood. I had freedom, sweet freedom to lay back with all my arms and legs at my total disposal, to stretch my limbs and saunter the neighborhood at my own whim. Now I have nothing, absolutely nothing, but this cursed, stinky swamp, with only the rats and a giant manic bipedal eyeball to keep me company. What a joke life has become. Whatever you do, young man, do not lower yourself and your dignity to such an extent that you will sacrifice your life in favor of a dubious transaction. Be wise." Mr. Tiberias puffed away thoughtfully on his pipe, in between exhaling comments in a dry, droll manner. "Looks like our little friend here has unfortunately fell for the world of appearances rather than the world of concept. This is why I have such power to do things that I can do and he doesn't. He has rooted all his trust, all his foundations into an artificial construct, a measly dream world of recycled vain mediocrity and fostered miserly, brooding routines instead of accessing the very raw truth of the matter, which lies unrefined, undefined, and unknown like a numinous grotto filled with treasures. Truth must be seen through a rather twisted, often uncomfortable, interpretive lens if we are to ascertain this perception of reality as a whole truth rather than in stagnated images. Yet he still wishes to gaze at the shadows on the cave wall. For him, his situation is faute de mieux. That is why, Cameron, you must not listen to this fool and his pitiable rhetoric and romantic folly. He's lived his life in the most profoundly incorrect way. He has prioritized the wrong ideals, his little Proustian moments, in order and rank, and now he's paying for it. This is his purgatory, perhaps hell. And to think, he speaks so facilely about sauntering on like a dog returning to its vomit. I'm quite sorry. I really wish I had discussed this sensitive topic with you in private, but I'm sure our nosy friend here wouldn't even hear it anyway. And if he did, it would go right over his head, or whatever he has left. By the way, I prefer the term humanoid eye on legs for your information. I hear you just fine, you cad. Where do you come off calling me daft? You're the silly reprobate who insisted we move post into this dowdy, dingy culvert where not one soul has travailed in all its eternity, save for us. It seems like you take the most pride in this little location. You take to sipping gin and mulling over age-old textbook and chivalric romantic literature. Then the second someone arrives, you find the quickest way to deceive them, like the charlatan you are. Did you hear that, Calvert? I didn't mince my words. That man is a good-for-nothing, and you ought to know full well what he's capable of doing. He knows no mercy, decency, or class, despite what layers of flattery and subterfuge, panache, and fancy regency garments he conceals himself under. Nothing can hide his calumny. It spills forth from his ego, which undulates beneath his skin. He can't even keep his mouth shut, and despite having a bigger eye than he does a mouth, he prefers to use that silver tongue liberally. And his eye, it's ever scanning, all-knowing, omnipresent, and hypersensitively aware of his surroundings. He takes different shapes and forms. You've been warned. Though his wit is alluring, and he constantly spouts out noble apothegms, his intent is perverse. Mr. Tiberias didn't so much as glance at Mr. Spencer, whose already frail voice broke amid his outraged invectives, and who required multiple interludes between shouting to catch his breath, again like a fish out of water. The way Mr. Tiberias looked on gave Cameron a slight sense that Mr. Spencer was akin to an innocuous, petulant little dog that was importuning desperately for attention, but he gave Mr. Spencer no satisfaction, and only grinned with mad delight, as if the frantic, apoplectic sight before him was exactly what he intended to provoke. Finally, he responded. "I find your hasty accusations most amusing. Tell us, what other riposts have you up your sleeve? You must be a great delight at parties. Your wit pours forth like a fountain of intellect. In all seriousness, why would I put myself through such misery and confusion myself? What would I get out of this? Yes, it is true that we all made a deal long ago, and we must take every action necessary to endure it and see to it that it pans out. You act as if I led that initial decision because of my seniority. That couldn't have been argued with, as the solemn fact is that I simply arrived first. Tough luck. While I wish that an equal opportunity could have been made available to every individual, it is not my duty to extend what little I have of the bargain to the most disagreeable, smarmy, tactless persons here. It is not in my best interest, nor is it anyone remotely in the interest of the well-being of the group, to suffer such a loss. I simply did the best I could with what little I had. I thought you understood this." Mr. Tiberias's tone shifted from one of jocularity and ebullience to sobriety and calm as he endeavored to counter Mr. Singer's series of diatribes. As he discussed these other details with Mr. Spencer, Cameron was not able to understand what any of it meant, as the terms and topics became increasingly esoteric. "I always knew you were sizing up every moment and opportunity to get your slimy hands around a titillating deal. At least I'm honest about my nefarious plans, if I had any. If I'm not entirely honest, I'm the first to tell you. Unlike some, I choose not to lead perfectly fine gentlemen down dubious paths. And yes, I'm referring to poor Mr. Plotnikov, who you so diabolically led down false paths. And what was there all that preposterous nonsense with geometrical hellfire? It wouldn't have been the worst of all imagined scenarios had our earthly friend had some sort of Euclidean Virgil to guide him, yet he was left on his lonesome. You've abandoned him. That is exactly your nature. To promise assistance, to regale everyone around you with your Hegel and your Comte, and I swear I'm not an intellectual, I'm a poet, and immediately followed by the inexorable, I swear I'm a poet, not an intellectual lectures. Give us a break. I told you already that the only reason such an incident occurred was because of his dissident, unlawful manner of entering the portal, which, as we all know, can result in disastrous circumstances when it comes to the way objects and phenomena are portrayed in the exchange rooms. Mr. Tiberias said impassively, "The simple truth is that our friend got a little spirit in him and spun up some daft idea in his silly head that he could merely walk in here unsubstantiated and unprimed, completely on his own accord. I've already informed him of the nature of the processes and how they work around here. Things operate on a different divination down here. They ring to an alternate frequency and appear deceptively. It takes one with an eye such as myself to fully comprehend them. They're not mere objects in their respectful places, manifesting as appearances, but reflections of a twisted reality. You cannot frivolously approach such objects and expect them to immediately be incorporated into your purview. You must contend with them. In this domain, certain laws are suspended. Others are added for mere effect, but prove to be completely unidentifiable. If you try to even grasp the finite, rudimentary artifice, you will be promptly overpowered by a cavalcade of new ones. Axioms, postulates, and theorems will chase you down, and you will be prodded with isosceles triangles instead of hot pokers. You will be tortured with the ever-fluctuating dimensions and self-replicating fractals. You will be verbally accosted with metonyms, lapidated with semiotics and dramaturgy, insulted with the vague melody of Gluck, defenestrated by polemics and rhetoric and burned alive with scathing Enlightenment ideas and knowledge, with ceaseless quest for the highest, deepest, most profound strain of it, which takes the form as ripe like a blooming orchard of esoteric ideas that defy identification and objectification. It is numinous and abstruse. Mr. Tiberias stopped abruptly and caught his breath, saw that Mr. Spencer had not even been listening, or at least appeared to be in a state of almost catatonic stupor, while Cameron had an expression of bewilderment and fear. Abruptly, Mr. Tiberias changed tack. "I merely quip again, my dear friend. Don't be so dejected. While you are a part of this most wretched, bizarre triumvirate of characters, do keep in mind that you are most alive, and in some ways you are more alive here than you are in those musty offices. Speaking of which, have you stood up to that great bulldog of a man yet?" "I beg your pardon?" "Well, have you dealt with Mr. Singer yet? Or do you insist on staying on his leash? I figured that you wouldn't want to remain so limited, considering how passionate you were when you went on and on about how his ways are abominable, ruthless, and harrowing. I deduced quite reasonably that you might accept the challenge this time rather than backing down timorously like countless times before." "Well, you said it was more complicated than that. It didn't really come to mind when I was being attacked for missing that meeting," Mr. Tiberias interpolated dryly. "Well, certainly the opportunity arose, and you took no action. Do you wish to remain a slave forever? It made me utterly sick to my stomach to see you ingratiating yourself so sycophantly with that harlot of a man. Did you feel better after licking his boot? Tell me, did it taste of forbidden gratitude and shameless career advancement?" Mr. Tiberias' single solid eye focused intently on Cameron. At this point, Mr. Spencer snapped out of whatever half or full sleep he might have been in and immersed himself in the conversation once more, interjecting with sudden, powerful voice, which seemed to surprise Mr. Tiberias. "Give the boy a break. He didn't come here to be attacked yet again by another loudmouth egomaniac. Lower your register a tad, and speak to him, not at him like a subordinate indentured servant meant to be browbeaten into submission. You're acting no differently than those bull market capitalists you speak so caustically about. Would you keep your meddlesome nose out of this? Your bloviating opinions are as good as dead air. In fact, the sounds the rats make are of more value than whatever you have to offer. Besides, when did I ever resemble an officious, power-hungry capitalist in any way? I'm only attempting to shock a bit of sense into our friend. No one in this earthly realm had the guts to teach him anything, to instruct him in physical or cerebral responsibilities, to show him how to maintain a good wit and an intellect, to constantly search for truth and the essence of it, or to dare to know and confront those devils in his life that persistently disquiet him. In here, we speak of devils in an ambiguous referral. Whether they are of tangible or material form is left equivocal. Whether they are wholly psychological is also left to the imagination. Oh, how that blasted world of ideas constantly befuddles us. We could have been like a dog who runs, eats, and sleeps without incessant perturbances as we poor humans, well, you poor humans, do. Look at Mr. Spencer. He cannot walk. He is cursed to exist in an uncomplimentary, unflattering dominion, and his mind grieves at him without a hint of exculpation. He constantly thinks of what was and how it was, past tense with an emphasis on the pluperfect. He has no second chance. Souls like his may still live and breathe, but in every other manner of speaking, they are dead. Mr. Tiberias said this with pity and dismay, and his voice altered to a lower, softer register, almost a whisper. Of course, Mr. Spencer couldn't hear him, but Cameron had the vaguest intimation that he knew he was being spoken about. Mr. Tiberias continued. Well, the fact is, you must act in some way, be it oral or even non-verbal, to assert yourself and make it evident to the dogged man that you are not to be meddled with. It's an arduous feat to pull off, but it's no Waterloo. But it will demand your highest faculties and skill. It requires an elusive mixture of intelligence, class, and will. I do not expect it to be perfect. Simply declare that you no longer wish to be badgered by him. It's simple. When we overtly proclaim our preferences in space to others, we quell the incensed beast within ourselves that would otherwise slowly eat away at our entire substance and render us mad. Listen, Cameron said in a surprisingly loud voice. I only failed to take action, if that makes any sense. I didn't purposefully brown-nose or act servilely. I just panicked. It happens sometimes. Well, maybe a lot. And you have no right to call me a coward. When it comes to going mad, I think you've already passed that a long time ago. I never said anything of the sort, Mr. Tiberias began. I merely implied that you are witlessly bereft of courage, tenacity, strength, and boldness, those attributes that led the first pioneers foolish enough to brave the Alps, or those fierce Mongol warriors that serve tenaciously on their horses to brutally conquer 9 million square miles of the world, or a mysterious Corsican boy who grew up to subject all of Europe to his will and meld the continent together under his meritocratic grip. Consider the Eskimos, those intrepid circumpolar people that prevail through unforgivingly harsh winters and have to hunt ceaselessly in order to procure food for the ruthless winters which last most of the year. If these kinds of men can achieve such grandeur, who's to say that you can't say a few words in retaliation to your boss? Come on, Cameron, let the thrill of life sink its juicy teeth into your pastel skin. Let it sting you above your greatest threshold and aim higher every day. Do not give in. Do not capitulate, silly man who uses you as a step stool because he lacked the vivacity to change his own life in his formative days and now is resentful and cogitating bitterly over his lost chances. Let him feel the boot for once. Mr. Tiberias' voice shifted back to his characteristic, bright, mirthful mien, and Cameron likewise felt more positive. Yes, I understand what you're saying. It's just not that simple. I wish I could change my situation and appreciate your help. I truly do. Again, Cameron was cut off abruptly by Mr. Tiberias. Let me be entirely forward with you, began Mr. Tiberias in an unusually candid tone, which took some getting used to. I am fully willing to help you, but I need some cooperation on your end in order for this to work properly. Now, the very notion that you attempted to arrive here by yourself leads me to believe that you are in dire need of my help, but I cannot be left in the dark. I need your help in return. All I require of you is your collaboration and trust. If you temporarily lend me both of those assets, I will be profoundly indebted. This is a two-way market deal, an alliance between two souls, a transaction so very dear that we cannot risk its demise. What we are dealing with is analogous to a great treasure. Do you understand? Cameron nodded, although not without some apprehension. He dared not ask what Mr. Tiberias meant. That eye fixated on him with even more intensity, and it felt like this would be an appropriate time to stop their conversation, and for Cameron to return to some much-needed preparation for his coming workday. At this point, Mr. Spencer was sound asleep, by the looks of his expression, a tad less distressed than he had been several minutes earlier. Seeing him this way, Cameron smiled affably and reminded himself of his duty back in the real world, or whatever most closely resembled reality, as it was getting harder and harder to tell. But before that, Mr. Spencer made an indiscernible sound, as if to attract Cameron's attention, and whispered breathlessly, "Please, my friend, I implore you to remember my wife. It's the least thing you could do." Cameron looked at Mr. Spencer with pity and responded, "Don't worry, I won't forget. I'll see what I can do. I believe I might be able to find her, based on what you told me, although I haven't heard of this bank before. What would you like me to tell her?" As Mr. Spencer confided in him what it was he wished to communicate, his voice was so weak and frail that his words were almost inaudible. Fortunately, if there was one thing Cameron was adept at, it was listening, wholly and openly. It is a skill that so many lack, yet Cameron had it in spades. When Mr. Tiberias went off in his prolonged soliloquies, Cameron listened attentively. When Mr. Singer barraged him with endless demands and queries, he listened. When Mr. Spencer, this deplorable, pathetic creature, whom no man had ever had the patience nor decency to lend an ear to, spoke, Cameron listened dutifully. He paid attention even to this one man in a vacant sewer of anomalous circumstance, the empty of all empties, tucked away in either the bowels of imagination or some vague form of reality. Yet here they were, whether by imaginary psychological projection or surreal undercurrent of our inner worlds, spilling out into that cascade of imagery. Mr. Tiberias snapped his fingers 3 times as if it were some magic spell to be repeated until he succeeded, and to think that, at the start of their discussion, he had been mocking sorcery in all its forms.